Can come on up. Okay. Thank you so much. It's so nice to see such a packed room for today's Atkinson Lecture. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Asma Malik, and I'm a professor here at the School of Journalism. I'm also director of the Journalism Research Center, and I'm very glad to see all of you here. A bit about the Atkinson Lecture. It's made possible by the Atkinson Foundation, and it's actually one of the university's oldest continuous events. It's one we look forward to at the School of Journalism because it gives us a chance to step back and think about something we do every day, the practice of journalism, how we do it, why we do it, and why it matters. And we count on our Atkinson lecturers to help us sit with these questions honestly and really dive into the impact of the journalism that we do. You might have been handed a note card as you arrived, or you might have one now. Please use that as your opportunity to ask a question if it comes up during the lecture. And after the lecture, Michelle and I will be on stage addressing the questions. Before we get started, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Toronto and Toronto Metropolitan University are in the Dish with One Spoon territory, protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, a treaty among the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas that binds us to share this land and to care for it. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, as well as settlers, newcomers, immigrants, refugees, and displaced people have been included into the treaty's responsibilities. As a settler and immigrant to Canada who benefits from settler privilege and ongoing colonial violences, I acknowledge that these harms are present and ongoing. And I think this carries particular weight today as we prepare to hear from Michelle Cyca, a Nehiyaw journalist and member of the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation in Treaty 6. That an Indigenous journalist is here to make the case for journalism, for its capacity to hold power to account, to resist disinformation, to pursue the truth, is itself an act of sovereignty on treaty land. And Indigenous journalists have always done this work, often at great cost. And yet, as Anderson and Robertson document in Seeing Red, which I see some of you from JRN 400, Critical Issues in Journalism, we just read this a few weeks ago. Canadian newsrooms have not merely failed Indigenous peoples, they have actively done colonial work, framing Indigenous resistance as threat and Indigenous peoples as in need of assimilation. The institutions that claim to value journalism have too often reinforced the very erasures that journalism should exist to challenge. And I'm so delighted that you're here today, Michelle. Your work at the Narwhal and the Walrus models what accountable, place-based journalism looks like. Today's lecture you've entitled A Defense of Optimism in Supposedly Hopeless Times. On treaty land, among journalists and those who believe in what journalism can be, I find cause for that optimism, and I'm so grateful that you're here to defend it. To introduce our lecturer today, I'm pleased to welcome my School of Journalism colleague, Professor Connie Walker, a Pulitzer Prize and Peabody Award-winning investigative journalist, member of the Okanese First Nation, and our Velma Rogers co-chair here at TMU. Connie?
Thank you so much, Asma, for the acknowledgement and introduction. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. I feel so lucky, I think we're all so lucky to have Michelle Cyca with us today to deliver this year's Atkinson Lecture. Not to take anything away from my School of Journalism colleagues, but I think I am the perfect person to introduce Michelle today. We never actually met before today in person, but we have a lot in common. We're both Cree, with roots from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatchewan. We both have relatives who were survivors of the St. Michael's Indian Residential School. And while doing a bit of research for this intro, I discovered that we both share a somewhat peculiar interest in birds. Mine is the game wingspan, in case you're curious. In her work as Bureau Chief of Conservation and Fellowships at the Narwhal, Michelle offers insightful analysis on Indigenous rights and Canadian politics. Her writing brings Indigenous practices and worldview and Indigenous voices into sharp focus and illustrates their critical role in contemporary issues. As a contributing writer to Maclean's and The Walrus, Michelle's work has had a tremendous impact. I'm not talking about the profile that she did on me, although that was great too. But her article on pretendians in the media and in academia was exceptionally thorough and comprehensive. It was an incisive, unflinching, and in my opinion, essential look at one of the most critical issues in academia and I think in Canada today. Michelle has quickly become one of the go-to Indigenous voices in journalism in Canada, and I'm so thrilled that we get to listen and learn from her today. Welcome, Michelle.
You're so petite. Hi, everybody. I hear there's going to be food after this, and if that's why some of you are here, I'm not offended in the slightest. And you're all going to hear more about my weird interest in birds, in case that was like a titillating nugget in this introduction. So, as many of you know, if you're journalism students or journalists, you usually put the headline on something after you've written it, or at least like decided what it's going to be. Usually you write a story, and then when it's done, you figure out how you're going to package it. But I came up with the title for this before I had really decided what I was going to talk about, which is kind of a backwards way to do things. And every time I've told somebody who's working in journalism or studying journalism that the title of my talk is "What is Journalism For?" they've laughed at me. But I feel like I've been thinking a lot in my work and my teaching of journalism students at UBC about the kind of existential challenges lately in the journalism industry. There's concrete challenges, which I'm going to get into very briefly, most of which I'm sure you've heard. But there's also kind of I think an ambient mood of like concern and despair as things change so rapidly, both within the industry and in the world that we are reporting on, that I think is making a lot of people question, like, what are we doing? How are we doing it? What is the value of this work? Is it something that I personally can sustain? So I did want to get a little existential today. So has anyone heard that things are bad in journalism? You can put your hands up. Only a couple of you? Great. See some offline people are here today. Yeah, I mean, there's objectively bad news, both if you're a staff writer, there's many layoffs and newsrooms closing. We hear about that every day. If you're a freelancer, which I am, you might be aware that the kind of industry standard rate of $1 a word for your work has not changed in over half a century. While I was putting this talk together, I thought about the 2002 Sex and the City episode where Carrie gets Vogue to pay her $4 a word. It came out 24 years ago, so I did the math, and that would be now almost $7.50 a word USD, which is over $10 Canadian that Carrie Bradshaw was getting paid. Not so here. And actually, one of my favorite fun facts about freelancing is that in 1931, Mussolini was paid $1 a word by Cosmopolitan to write for them, almost 100 years ago. I don't want to dwell on Mussolini, but I think about that a lot. Lots of other more contemporary examples of fascism that we could get into. But aside from the payment, I don't want to dwell on that, even though one of my editors is here. I have been thinking, there's a critical civic function for journalism, obviously, but there's all these challenges, all these pressures. There's AI, there's the social media that people are getting their news from, even when they're not consuming news, they're consuming content that is packaged like news. There's the insanely rapid news cycles that I think many of us find exhausting to try and keep up with and respond to. There are violations of press freedom, but these have all changed like how journalism happens in a way that's really destabilizing. And while I think the technical skills of journalism remain the same, the fundamentals of reporting and how you do that, I think you have to be like operating in an ecosystem that has vastly different demands on journalism than it used to and journalists. And even aside from that, I think it can be a really hard job and has been for a long time. But I think it's fair to acknowledge that it's harder now in many measurable ways and many spiritual ways. So if this seems like a depressing way to start off, I just want to start low so we can go high. Because I think despite all this bad news, and I spent a lot of time thinking about it, I think the future of journalism and the potential for journalism is a lot brighter and a lot more hopeful than it appears. And I think often about how, in my work, I see a lot of pushback lately to Indigenous rights, particularly in the context of where I report from BC. There's a lot of pushback, there's a lot of resistance. I would say the climate for reconciliation and attitudes towards it are worse now in many ways than they have been for decades. But in some ways, I see that as a sign that things are finally starting to happen, that when you start to see concrete changes as a result of a big social shift, that's when you encounter resistance. People only respond when they actually perceive that change as uncomfortable for them. And in the same way, I think so much of the pressures on journalism and the efforts to strip journalism of its power, of billionaires and hedge funds to acquire journalism outlets in order to control their messaging. These are responses to the power that journalism has and its potential. And so I see in those efforts a sign of the continued importance and the ongoing power and potential of journalism. So, if it wasn't a threat, if it wasn't frightening to people in power, if it didn't have the potential and impact that it does, I don't think there would be so many forces trying to disassemble the industry. So, obviously, landscape is in flux. We have to respond to it somehow. And what I'm going to argue here today is that I think the way to respond to these challenges and the way to survive in this industry, to find hope and meaning in your work, is to put more of your actual human self into everything that you're doing, not just how your stories read on the page or how they sound, the finished product, but every step of the process, I think, requires more of you as a person to be a part of it, not a theoretically objective conduit for facts, but a human being connecting with other people, which requires building trust in your work, both with the people you're speaking to and with the people who read it or consume it in some ways. I think more than ever, as we are seeing just like an overwhelming volume of AI-generated content, of slop, of misinformation online, it's so critical to be a human being who stands behind your work, and a person who's connecting with other people who can, may have opinions, may have perspectives on things, may not be like perceived as neutral, but is a recognizable human being with a perspective on the world. So I did think, as I was talking about this, I was like, what if everybody here came in really optimistic already and now I've bummed you out? But I do teach, and I feel like my students, many of them are approaching graduation, and they're like trying to get their heads around how to do this thing that they want to do. And, I tell them, and I'll tell you, I feel like the bad news gets a lot of attention because in some ways journalists are drama queens. And we also know that negative headlines get a lot of clicks. So we are inclined to dwell on the bad news. But I think that people have always been worried about the decline of media. I don't think that's new. And I think if you look beyond our industry, if you talk to anyone outside of media, in agriculture and healthcare, in housing, they would say like there was a peak of this industry where we were doing things well and we're past it and now everything is getting worse. Maybe people in AI or crypto are like not feeling that. They might think that it's all uphill. But I would say like there are many interconnected systems also that are struggling right now and struggling for the same reasons, which I think are labor issues, extractive capitalism, systemic racism and oppression. So the pressures on journalism are the pressures on every industry. And I also like to remind myself that it's useful to not be so myopic about my industry. And also to think, when people talk about a golden age of media, like Carrie Bradshaw getting paid $10 a word in 2026 rates, they're thinking about a very specific subset of people for whom it was a golden age. I would say there was never a golden age of media for Indigenous journalists, for people of color, for immigrants, for disabled journalists, for trans journalists, and in some ways now is better than it's ever been. The fact that I can work with other Indigenous journalists on stories that center Indigenous voices and perspectives that can be translated into Indigenous languages, I don't think that's ever been possible before in mainstream Canadian media. So in some ways, I think that things are getting better. I'm gonna move ahead. So my point before I move off the slide, I think everyone's seen my title for long enough, is I do think every day in my work at the Narwhal, the work I do as a freelancer with my students, I see like not only that journalism is important, but also that it can be fun and meaningful, that it can be a source of connection. And I think that's what people really need right now too, is there's so much isolation and loneliness and fear. When I report on Indigenous rights, what I see more than anything is that people are terrified by what they perceive as such a fundamental shift to how they understand the world and their place in it and their power or their freedom, their perception of their freedom. That comes from a place of fear. And so I think in some ways, I do think that the antidote is like connecting to those human emotions, to those responses, and trying to just break through what people think they already know, what their algorithmic bubble has kind of insulated them from, and try and sort of surprise them with our humanity and their own. Yeah. I think the trust piece is really important. If many of you might be aware of this, if you look at, say, the Reuters reporting on digital news, but trust in journalism is at a kind of an all-time low. It's 20 percentage points below where it was even a decade ago. People have less trust in news than they ever have. But what's interesting there is that they have the most trust in local news. So of all the outlets that they're likely to put their trust in, it's the ones that they know personally. And I often think about the journalists that I really look to for information, who are people often in my community who I trust as individuals. Jen St. Dennis at the Tyee, my colleagues at the Narwhal. Also Dan Fumano, who's a city reporter for the Vancouver Sun, which is just an example I would like to linger on because the Vancouver Sun is owned by Postmedia. Do people know anything about Postmedia? Any Postmedia haters in the crowd? I'm a hater. I think Postmedia is a terrible entity. I'm not going to look at Denise right now. They're sucking the lifeblood out of so many papers. They are destroying arguably journalism in Canada, and they're being subsidized by the federal government to do it. I think they should be defunded. I have no faith at all in Postmedia as an institution, but I have a lot of faith in Dan as a city reporter. I trust his reporting. I trust his work. And I think when we look at declining trust in media, we're often looking at how people feel about institutions or outlets and not about the people behind them. And I think that's such a missing piece of the conversation often, is like people trust individuals, they trust human beings who are reporting on issues. And I try and keep that in mind. Like, I think, I don't trust Postmedia, but I trust Dan as a reporter. And I try and think of myself as somebody who, separate even from the institutions that I work of, that I'm proud to be a part of. I would like people to be trusting me as an individual reporter and be somebody who stands behind my own work. I do want to just start maybe by rolling back the clock to where I started in journalism, which was with this magazine called Sad Mag. In 2009, I moved back to Vancouver from Victoria, and some of my friends who were in a publishing grad program at the time had just started this magazine. When I got more involved, we turned it into a backronym. Do you guys know what a backronym is? So you take a word and you turn it into an acronym retroactively. So we turned it into Stories, Art, and Design. But initially it was just Sad Mag because they thought that was a funny name for a magazine where everybody has seasonal depression in the city where it's published. And it was just a magazine being made by a bunch of people in their early 20s who were in grad school, who were in a publishing program, who want to write about queer art and design in their city. And I got involved because my best friend was part of the founding team. Nepotism, it always works. Don't worry, I didn't make any money from it, so I'm not morally compromised. But at the time, working on this magazine is really how I learned the fundamentals. I learned to write, I learned how to meet a deadline. Later, I learned how to put a production schedule together, how to get a magazine printed, how to write grants, how to throw parties when you release an issue, all of which have come in really, really handy since then. But the big thing that I got out of it was how fun it is to make something with people you like and respect that's really what you care about. Like, there was nobody greenlighting our ideas. We could really do anything we wanted. If we wanted to do a choose your own adventure game in an issue, if we wanted to make like a little cryptic font and have people decode messages in the magazine, if we wanted to do an entire issue about cheese, which you can see there on the left. We could do it. We could do whatever we wanted. And I channeled a little bit of this last month in Narwhal, where we made this game, Lovebirds of Canada, my niche bird interest. born out of many, many months of idle conversation in our Slack about which birds we thought would make the best boyfriends. Spoiler, people agree with us. I think that Canada geese are probably the best boyfriends out there, most popular result. But this was just a reminder that like you can have fun in this work. A lot of people enjoyed this quiz. I think we have more than 10,000 people who've done it now. And it is full of fun bird facts, so it's educational. I thought more people might be annoyed by this, but even our serious readers seem to enjoy it. But I think it's important to remember that like you can do enjoyable things too. And more than that, I think like the fundamental thing I got out of starting my career this way through the unorthodox path of starting a weird art magazine with my friends is that I feel like it's taught me that you shouldn't do work that you don't want to do. It sounds really basic, but I feel like if you're guided by the things that you care about, that you think are important, even if other people don't understand why they're important, I wouldn't expect everybody to find their passion making a bird quiz. But if you care about it, like you will do good work. And I mean, I feel like you can follow those interests out anywhere. I'm a contributor at The Walrus, and my editor Harley is here. And with him, I've managed to write about Indigenous rights and Indigenous identity fraud, which are serious topics, but also about parenting and space exploration and how much I hate dealing with government communications professionals and PR people. And I'm also on the board of Tapwaywin Media, which is an entirely First Nations female-led nonprofit that publishes Indigenous. And I get to work at the Narwhal. I get to teach students about freelancing at UBC. Please don't count how many jobs I have. It's kind of crazy. But I feel really lucky to have all of them because all of them are driven by these things that I love doing. And I feel like the curiosity and the excitement that animates a piece of work that comes from your own genuine interest in what you're reporting on is what makes it valuable, what makes it human, that shows that you're a person who's reporting with perspective and intention and values behind your work. And so I think in an industry where I think we can all safely say we're not doing this for the money, it's really important that you be doing things that you love and that you care about. And I think as many of your students and you're thinking about the future, if there's one thing that should guide you, it's following your passions and your interests to do the things that you care about doing. All right, I'm skipping ahead. Like Connie mentioned, I am an Indigenous. Oh, no, I'm going to leave it there for 1 second. We're going to linger on the birds for a second. So the pursuit of trust and those values are, I think, a big part of how I approach my work as an Indigenous journalist. So as mentioned, I'm a member of Muskeg Lake, which is Cree Nation and Treaty 6. It's like an hour outside of Saskatoon. Obviously, I have a mixed background. So my ancestors also came from Scotland, from Sweden, from Germany, settled in the prairies. And I grew up with only really one grandparent in my life. My other grandparents passed away when I was very young. But my grandma Mary, who was born on Muskeg Lake, was a big part of my childhood and my life. She was my connection to that part of my ancestry, to my family at Muskeg Lake. And in my reporting, when I'm reporting on Indigenous issues and communities, I try and be kind of clear with people about what kind of Indian I am. You know, I didn't grow up on Muskeg Lake. I didn't grow up on a reserve. I grew up in a city. I have the privilege that comes from being white passing, which affects how people interact with me, how they talk to me, what they think of me when they meet me. I try and be clear that I'm First Nations and not Métis, which a lot of people think if you're mixed, you're Métis. Surprised by how often this comes up. And those aspects of my identity, they shape my reporting, they shape my experience of the world, and I try and bring them into the reporting relationships that I have. I try and bring them into my interactions with Indigenous sources, into my reporting on Indigenous issues, because I think that context and perspective is really key, both for how I'm understanding and reporting on issues, but also I think for helping people understand them as complex and multifaceted rather than trying to present an Indigenous view on things. Or like an Indigenous perspective that's really uniform. I think there is more interest now in media in trying to understand diverse perspectives, quote unquote diverse perspectives, but it can have this flattening effect where often people who are part of underrepresented communities are kind of asked to be like a general voice for everyone of that perspective. And I think it's important to resist that in your own work and be clear about your relationality to the people that you're representing or reporting on. So as a Cree person, I'm a member of a Canadian minority. We're underrepresented in media. I think in the last Canadian Association of Journalists survey, something like 3.5% of journalists in Canada are Indigenous. And so if you are an Indigenous journalist, as anyone, or if you're a journalist of any underrepresented community, I think you have this kind of double burden. You're expected to be reporting on issues from your community, from all communities like your community, all Indigenous communities all across Canada. You're expected to be able to translate those stories for non-Indigenous audiences, for instance, to make them legible, to make them clear. And you're also kind of expected, this is the doubled burden, or the tripled burden in a way, you're supposed to kind of be like a visible example of diversity in the industry. I appreciate being a go-to Indigenous journalist in Canada now. It's a wonderful position that I enjoy being in, but I'm aware of the fact that in part it's because there's so few Indigenous journalists, and that there's, you know, an expectation that my presence, there's a belief that my presence is a kind of like accomplishment or accolade for the industry and a sign of how it's changing and progressing. You know, Pasent Matar explained it best actually in a 2020 essay called Objectivity is a Privilege Afforded to White Journalists, which is still very relevant today, where she wrote, under the banner of diversity, racialized people are told to bring ourselves and our perspectives, but if we bring too much of them, we get held back. It's something that I wrote about for the Walrus. Here's a story that I wrote about workplace diversity and the challenge for Indigenous employees, which is that I think like many of the people I spoke to, not only in media, said you get a kind of burnout when you're in an industry, any industry, whether you're working in museums and education and media, and you're expected to do so much, not just your job, but also representing an entire people, an entire kind of experience. And a lot of the people I spoke to had burned out on their jobs, had left them, even if they were at the pinnacle of their career, because being asked to do so much was not sustainable. And, you know, I think we see that in journalism too. I've seen a lot of amazing journalists leave the industry for various reasons, sometimes to do other kinds of important work, often to make journalism better for the next generation of Indigenous journalists. You know, Duncan McHugh was at the CBC for a long time, and now he helps to train other people to report better on Indigenous communities and support up-and-coming Indigenous journalists. Candace Callison, who's teaching at UBC now, a longtime incredible journalist from Tahltan. Connie Walker, who's here at this school. Other people like Wabgashig Rice, who has left journalism to write amazing novels, or Angela Starrett. And that's fantastic, but it can mean if you're part of any underrepresented group, at a certain point you don't see a lot of people to look up to in the industry. You don't see a lot of career paths for yourself that you can follow. And for that reason, I feel like it's taken a long time for me to feel like I have a community of Indigenous journalists. This is some of them here. So Steph Wood, who I work with at the Narwhal, Kara McKenna and Eden Fine Day, who are at Indigenews. That's Santana Drever. She's our new Indigenous Journalism Fellow at the Narwhal. I also want to mention Kayla McInnes, who's an incredible Métis journalist who's in Vancouver as well. Kara was the first Indigenous editor I ever worked for and might still be the only Indigenous editor who's ever edited me. Which is not incredible. And most of the Indigenous journalists I've talked to have said for most of their career, they're the only Indigenous journalist in their newsroom. They maybe have never worked with another Indigenous journalist. They certainly haven't worked up the chain with like an Indigenous editor. And I feel like having a group of journalists who have shared experience and in some ways shared perspectives who I can talk to about reporting challenges or how I'm approaching a story or just like things we're encountering in our work, it really cracked something open for me in some ways. I think I felt very isolated often, or like I was struggling to figure out how to approach a story in isolation. And I didn't realize until I had it how valuable it is to have people who you can talk to who have at least some understanding of the perspective you're coming from, the context that you're trying to get your head around. It makes us less lonely. But also together, I think it makes us capable of doing better work. Got to pause to drink from my huge water bottle. Where are we in this photo? We are at Fort Langley. Fort Langley is a historic site near Langley in Vancouver. It's our little trading outpost, and it's like many heritage sites in Canada, like surprisingly dilapidated. Everybody goes there as a child on a field trip, and then you go back as an adult, and you're like, oof, I gotta spruce this place up. But they're building an incredible Salish cultural center right across the street that's glorious, that's opening this spring. So next time we'll take our photo there. When I say that it makes our work better to have this community, what I mean in some ways is that all of us come into this understanding that a lot of Indigenous communities and sources have good reason to be mistrustful of journalists. They're often reluctant to engage in an interview, to speak to journalists, and have good reasons for that. There have historically been a lot of bad reporting on Indigenous communities, and I would argue there's a lot of bad reporting now. It's a contemporary problem that I'm going to get into. And it's hard to represent these stories with complexity, I think. Like, the challenge, I think, of doing news reporting is you often have to do it, if you're doing daily news, if you're doing a short news story, you have to write from the assumption that everybody is coming into it with kind of a shared understanding of what the context is, and you're just giving them the facts to overlay on that context. You have to assume you're operating with kind of a shared understanding of the world. And it's only in kind of a longer form or in an outlet, I think, like Indigenous News, that's centered on a different worldview and a different perspective, that you can be operating in a different context and be giving a little bit more perspective. And it's something that I love about feature writing, is that you have the length and the space, I think, to complexify the facts that you're putting out for people. I think this is an example of a story that I really like that does that well. It's from the Narwhal. It's reported by Steph Katasawat-Wood, who's our incredible reporter. And the time she spent building relationships and trust with the Heiltsuk Nation, which is one of the First Nations off the central coast of BC. She spent a lot of time reporting with the community, building relationships, going back to sources and checking things carefully before they were published, which often meant very long timelines on stories, which can be a difficult thing to take in a fast-paced news environment. But because of the time she put in, and because of a story that she did in January last year about a Heiltsuk village that is the site of an abandoned cannery that's kind of leaching chemicals into the waters of the Great Bear Rainforest, which is a protected area. Not a timely piece of news, but something that was still important to the community and that ended up being really widely read and really impactful. Heiltsuk invited her to the nation in May. We were the only small outlet invited for a ratification feast for their constitution. And she's able to report this story while she was there about their housing strategy, how they're thinking about place, how they're thinking about home. She took the photos, which are amazing. And I think it's a really beautiful story, and it's a story that was only possible because she took the time to build trust and relationships with Heiltsuk, where they felt like she was a person that they could invite into the community to do this reporting. I see a lot of journalists at all stages of their career who are kind of afraid to do stories like this, in a way, who are afraid to report in Indigenous communities. I don't know if Connie experienced this when she taught reporting in Indigenous communities, but I feel like a lot of people are really nervous to go out to an Indigenous community or a powwow or an event or talk to an Indigenous elder, ask them questions, which really makes me sad because I feel like Native people are really nice, first of all, and we're very funny, we're very approachable. But I see a lot of people who are like, well, it's not my story to tell, also, who think that only Indigenous journalists can be reporting on Indigenous issues. And I just want to say for the record, that's not true. Anyone can do a story about a person of a different experience, of a community with a different experience, if they're going into it with integrity and curiosity and they're willing to learn and ask questions and do their research up front. You can prepare yourself to do a story well. Some of my favorite reporting about Indigenous communities is done by non-Indigenous journalists, Erin Hemmons and Amy Romer, who are both at Indigenous News, who do incredible reporting. Amber Bracken, who's now at the Narwhal, who's done amazing reporting for years with Indigenous communities in places like Wet'suwet'en. It's about taking the time to build those relationships. And so I just feel like while I have a literal podium, I would like to tell everyone here, even if you're not Indigenous, you can do a good job reporting Indigenous stories. And more than that, there are many stories that Indigenous people shouldn't be entirely responsible for reporting. It's really exhausting in some ways to be covering all the hard stories about your communities. I would like that burden to be shared. To that end, I'm going to talk a little bit about Pretendian reporting. Like Connie mentioned, I've done a lot of reporting about Indigenous identity fraud. It's become a beat for me, unfortunately, because I find it sort of an unpleasant topic to reflect on and write about, and also because it happens constantly. So it's like a fire hose all the time of drama. So this is a story that I worked on in 2022. Or 2023. I reported it at 2022. Reported it at the BAM Center, and then it was published by Maclean's. It's about a professor at Emily Carr University who was hired as part of a restricted hire for Indigenous faculty, which means they were only hiring Indigenous people for these roles. She got hired under that program, and then after she'd been there for about 10 months, rumors were circulating that she wasn't actually Indigenous. Rumors with a lot of, I think, substantiated information behind them. The university was really, really reluctant to look into it. They didn't want to acknowledge it, and I ended up quitting that job. At the time I was freelancing part-time, but I went full-time freelance, and I'm not going to say that the best reporting is motivated by revenge, but I was like really upset when I left, and I thought somebody has to look into this story, and eventually I thought, why not me? I could do it. And I felt like reporting it was really challenging, in part because I wanted people to come away from it understanding Indigenous identity a little bit better. And I felt like to do that, there had to be a personal perspective in there for them to connect to and understand. There had to be like a person to guide them through the nuances of what it means to be Indigenous, what it means to have an Indigenous family, what it means to be a part of these communities, to have this citizenship in an Indigenous nation. And at a certain point, I realized all the sources I talked to were kind of anxious about being that person. They were afraid of backlash. And so I wrote it really as kind of a personal reported investigation. So there's a lot of my own history in there, my family history. And I felt like it was my responsibility in some ways to be transparent about who I was and what I was bringing to that story, that to pretend I was approaching it purely objectively from the perspective of someone who's just interested in reporting out, an interesting piece of news would have been both a disingenuous way to present it, and also it would have resulted in a worse story. There wouldn't have been, I think, as much context or meaning for people in there. There have been a lot of these stories since then. There were a lot before I published that one. Probably the biggest one of recent years was Buffy St. Marie. And this is another piece that I did for the Walrus that is, it wasn't my investigation, it was Jeff Leo's at the CBC into Buffy St. Marie. But I had a lot of concerns, again, as an Indigenous journalist, about how that story was reported. I think it's possible with any sensational topic to report on it in a way that leaves people really scandalized and like titillated by the story, but not necessarily more informed. And I had a lot of feelings about what was left out of the Buffy St. Marie investigation. Buffy St. Marie said she was that she was born on Piapot, which is a Cree Nation, and reconnected as an adult with her family there, that she had been traditionally adopted and back into the community. But the story didn't talk about Cree adoption. It didn't really talk about adoption in any detail. It didn't talk about how 60 scoop adoptions really worked. There were no Cree sources actually at all in the story. There were a lot of commentators, but nobody from a Cree community, which I thought was really a big gap. And I felt like you could come away from that story thinking Buffy St. Marie had fabricated her identity, but you wouldn't have any understanding of what the 60 scoop experience was like, why many survivors of it wouldn't have connections to their communities, why they might not have documentation, what an Indigenous adoption means, how the 60 scoop happened, and how the Indian Act works. Like, that's the context that I think people need to understand around that reporting. And so when I do a story that's about Indigenous identity fraud, that's about Indigenous rights, that's about any issue that I think has become so polarized that has the opportunity to erode trust further, to make people more distrustful of Indigenous people, more distrustful of Indigenous stories, I really think about the responsibility of not just presenting the facts, but situating them in a context that allows people to make more sense of them, and to come away with a little bit more empathy. So the last story I want to talk about that I think some of you might have read before this talk is about a playwright named Jenny Lauzon. She wrote a play called 1939, which was about a residential school where the students are learning and performing a Shakespeare play. And she said it was based on her own father's experience learning Shakespeare in a residential school as a boy. This came to me by way of an Indigenous theater employee who was working on a production and was really concerned both about the content of the play and about Lausanne's ancestry. And while I try not to do too many of these stories, I had a lot of concerns as well once I read through the play. Like I mentioned, my grandmother went to a residential school. She went to the same residential school as Connie's father, St. Michael's, which is in Duck Lake, Saskatchewan. And like a lot of residential schools, it has a really grim history. You can learn some of that if you listen to Connie's podcast, Stolen. But I often think about a report I read from an Indian agent that was published a few years before my grandmother went there, in which he wrote that half the children who'd been sent to the school had died, mostly from tuberculosis. And in the report, he wrote, I have a quote actually, that you can't overlook the fact that children were dying from diseases that they caught at the school, that it was because they were at the school that they were dying. And that's a report that was written, in 1910, and decades later, children were still going to these schools. I think about that all the time. The history of residential school is an important thing to get right, and I felt like this was a play that was distorting that history, that was connecting with people who liked the version that they were seeing there, who could go and say, like, oh, residential school wasn't all bad. These kids were learning Shakespeare. It was quite disingenuous, and also her own framing of her father going to a residential school, despite her saying that he, at most, was like 4 or 5 generations removed from their Indigenous ancestors, is not how residential schools worked. Residential schools were an assimilationist tool, so they were for children who were considered Indians under the Indian Act. If you weren't considered an Indian under the Indian Act, the government was like happy to let you exist and pay your taxes. They were not scooping up every kid with a drop of Indigenous ancestry and sending them to these schools, which were expensive to run, which is why they relied on so much labor from the children who went there to keep them operating. And I feel like, these are details that are important to get right. It's easy to dramatize and distort this history. And it's also hard in a reporting context to get people to care about those facts. They're not as exciting. They're not as dramatic. And so in some ways, a story about somebody who's fabricating their identity, that has a little bit of scandal, that has a little bit of drama, I see as a way to get people to learn about a facet of Canadian history and Indigenous history that they might not otherwise care enough to read 3,000 words about. And I feel like I'm able in some ways to do that because, again, I'm bringing my own perspective on it. I'm bringing my understanding of residential school history, my connection to it, my desire for people to understand it better. That's what's animating the story, and I think that's what helps it gives the story its impact. So every time I do a story on Indigenous identity fraud, and I am kind of working on another one, I understand that there's multiple complexities at play, but I see every one of them as an opportunity to engage people in facets of Indigenous identity, our specificity, our nations and citizenship, what those mean in concrete terms, our laws, as it's a way to get people to care about those things. What you're doing, I think, in a long-form piece of reporting always is trying to convince someone to care enough to stick with it for the whole length of the piece. And the goal always is for them to come away with that richer understanding. Not all attention is fruitful. I think we can understand that in a media environment. Just because people are paying attention to something doesn't mean they're learning from it, doesn't mean they're being critically informed. So I think it's important when telling these stories to think not just like, what is the story that I'm telling, but how am I telling it? How can I do it in a good way that will make people come away, ideally, a little less hostile, a little less mistrustful, a little more informed about the world. So that's the standard I think that I'm trying to live up to in this work. It's not easy though. I said, and we've all said, reporting about Indigenous people used to be bad. I would say we were at like a real low for the quality of reporting that I'm seeing about Indigenous people. So this is a story that was published recently in BC, where BC right now is up in arms in some ways about a couple of recent legal cases that have recognized Aboriginal title. Aboriginal title is so-called because it's recognized in the Constitution. It's a Canadian term of law for the Cowichan tribes and also for Musqueam First Nation. So recognizing that they have title over Vancouver and part of Richmond. What this means in concrete terms, still has to be hammered out by the courts. It's a claim that these nations are making against the government for taking their land. Most of BC is unceded, which means the First Nations there never signed treaties giving it to the Canadian government. They never agreed to give it up, and they've inhabited it continuously. So there are many title questions that the government has been kicking down the road for decades and decades that are finally being resolved in the courts in some ways. People are panicking about this decision, to put it lightly. I don't know if it's reached you all the way here in Toronto, but in BC, there's like a toxic soup of panic and fear that Indigenous people are coming to like kick homeowners out of their houses, seize their properties, turn everything into a casino, real racist stuff. So here we have a story about the Comox First Nation, which owns a trailer park and is giving residents there 2 years until their lease ends, and then they're going to redevelop the property on reserve into housing for reserve members. It's from the headline, you would think, here's a First Nation kicking homeowners out of their homes. They're evicting these poor old ladies. It's really, this is the framing of every story right now, though, is like Native people are coming for your stuff. And I see in this reporting the way non-Indigenous sources are often afforded this kind of credibility. You know, if a homeowner in Richmond is like, I can't sell my property now because of the Cowichan decision, that's just treated as a fact. Despite the fact that I don't think anyone has looked into it. Whereas whenever Cowichan puts out another statement saying, we have no intention of claiming people's private property, that's not what this is about, it's about the government's responsibility and accountability to us, it's a claim that they're making. It's like kind of inherently treated as untrustworthy. And, you know, because there are so few people, I'm not one of them, who understand the nuances of Aboriginal title, of legal land claims, it's a lot easier, I think, for people to seize on the scary headlines, to panic about what it means. And it's very enticing to do that kind of reporting, I think, for a lot of outlets, because it gets a lot of attention. People care about it, they want to know about it, they want more interest in it. And I think it's easy to justify that by saying, like, this is what people want to know, this is what they're asking for, they want more of these stories. But I think part of the responsibility that journalists and journalism outlets have is to not just think, like, what do people think they want to know? What do they think they already know that we can tell back to them? But, like, what are they missing? Like, what don't they know? What don't they know that they don't know? And seeing how lopsided the narratives are in BC right now about Indigenous rights and title has just made me think so much more about how starved I think a lot of people are for like meaning and context in the news that they're consuming. It's easy to just, I think, scroll through like a million TikToks by influencers who are rebranding themselves as citizen journalists and come away really panicked about the world. And I think that there's a responsibility now in all media outlets to be providing, I think, the context that people are missing. So, let's see, I can't remember what's next. Before I get into what we do at the Narwhal, I wanted to dwell on two stories that are a little positive to return to my optimism, which are the kinds of things I would like to be doing when I'm not telling people about Indigenous identity fraud. And I think an example of what is possible now, despite some of the bad reporting we're seeing on First Nations, there are good stories happening. This is one of them. It's a story we did at the Narwhal in collaboration with Indigenous, which is a story about First Nations in the prairies that are bringing buffalo back to their lands. So there used to be millions of buffalo on the prairies, for those of you who don't know, and they were systematically hunted almost to extinction, partly to starve Indigenous people so that they would be easier to forcibly relocate from their lands. So it's part of a cultural genocidal effort, and nearly literally genocidal for buffalo, which were very endangered. But now we're seeing them back on the land. It's a really interesting ecology story because buffalo are a keystone species, which means when they're back on the land, you see all these changes in grassland ecosystems as a result. It's very cool. And we were able to get this story translated into Cree, working with a Cree language keeper named Dorothy Thunder. And it was really amazing to do it because the collaboration of the story was entirely Treaty 6 journalists and language keepers. So Kayla's Métis from Treaty 6, Karen Eden at Indigenous, who also worked on it, are Treaty 6, Eden's from Sweetgrass, and Kara's from the Michelle First Nation, she's Métis also, and Dorothy, who's from Treaty 6. And I just look at the story and think it's incredible that it exists. It couldn't have happened at any other time in history. To make something like this and share it so widely, you can listen to Dorothy reading the story, which is one of my favorite things. And you know, it wouldn't have gotten published when like Tina Brown at Vanity Fair was paying people $2 a word, or like Carrie Bradshaw at Vogue. Not that kind of media ecosystem. That wasn't for us, but we have this. We can do this kind of story now, and that just makes me really hopeful. And this was actually the second story of mine that Dorothy translated. The first one is this story that I did for the Walrus about social media, which is, I actually hate social media. I'm a big hater. But I think it's very cool that Indigenous language learners or language teachers are using it to teach people Mi'kmaq, Cree, Anishinaabe, like all of these languages are reaching people around the world because they can watch a short-form video of somebody teaching them a word or a phrase every day. And language is something that is meant to be taught orally. We all learned to speak by listening to people around us talk when we were babies. And so it was a really cool story, and Dorothy translated this one into Cree as well. You can also listen to this story at the Walrus. And I mean, it might be kind of gauche to put compliments about my work up in a presentation, but I want to share this because when I saw it, it made me so happy. So this is Chelsea Vowell. She's a Cree language teacher at the University of Alberta. And she posted on Blue Sky. I actually didn't know she wrote this until I stumbled across it by searching my own name, which is really cringe. But she said, you know, it's so hard to find contemporary Cree language resources to teach students with. You can get a lot of historical texts, you can get a lot of fundamentals, but you can't get like a contemporary piece of writing in Cree. And so for intermediate language learners, it's kind of hard for them to access new resources or things that are written in a contemporary context. And just thinking about people learning Cree by reading about our reporting on Buffalo or TikTok, just like, it reminds me that our work reaches a lot of people outside of this industry too. It has impacts that are often hard to remember when you're really in it. And that just fills my heart with so much happiness to think of people reading about buffalo on the prairies and listening to Dorothy tell that story. The last one I want to talk about is just the story about Connie that I did. Thanks again to Harley, who's here, for assigning this to me. It was such a dream to do it. Obviously, Connie is a legend. I was so thrilled to profile her. And because we had, you know, her podcast Stolen was such a huge thing for me and my family, because it was about this place that everyone in our extended family, everyone on Muskeg Lake for many decades had gone. And, you know, when I was originally started reporting this story, it was after Connie had just won a Pulitzer and a Peabody and was working on the third season of Stolen. And then partway through reporting the story, Spotify canceled the podcast, which changed the reporting. And it made me think, as I was working on it, like, we often think of journalism, in the decline of journalism, quote unquote, you know, outlets closing, podcasts that we love being canceled, journalists like getting laid off. We think of these things as kind of natural outcomes, like that people don't care about these stories and that's why they disappear. But spending time thinking about Stolen, which was a hugely successful podcast that won all of these awards and reached millions and millions of people, that was objectively by every measure of success, getting canceled so that Spotify could spend more time and money on shows like the Joe Rogan Experience. I was like, this is not about audiences. Like, this is not about what people want or need or what they care about or the stories they want to hear. This is about capitalist greed and like executives making bad decisions. You know, we have to like resist, I think, the framing that if our journalism fails to have the impact that we imagine in terms of reaching millions of people, if an outlet that we think is doing important work closes, it's not because it deserved to fail or that it didn't succeed even by like the standards of like economic standards, because it wasn't profitable, because it wasn't successful. The problem again is that we live in a time of really extractive capitalism. And the reason journalism is struggling is the reason everything is struggling. That unfettered parasitic capitalist interest. You know, I don't want to sound too much like a communist up here, but I'm not mad about it. And I think we have to resist in our work and also in our approach thinking of this framing as inevitable. We have to think about how we could report this story with a little bit more context, both for ourselves and for others. Because there's a reality, there is a shared reality that we should inhabit that shouldn't be dictated by the people who are making the decisions to cancel shows, to close outlets, who are trying to shape a media ecosystem to their interests. I do also want to say, when we talk about the decline of journalism, we're usually talking about the decline of institutions, and many of those institutions can and should change a little bit. They are fallible, they can make bad decisions. And And we don't always have to be redeeming a bad model that didn't work for people, that doesn't work now, that excluded so many voices, especially when there are new and nonprofit institutions, the Narwhal, the wonderful Narwhal, but also places like the Local, the Tyee, Indigenous, the Independent, that demonstrate that you can create different models of how to do journalism. You can create different ways to tell stories. You can do things differently in a new way. And if somebody won't let you do that, you can start a weird magazine like Sad Mag and do it yourself. You aren't beholden to the way things used to happen. And you can work in solidarity with your peers to change things that are not working. So, I mean, I'm a member of Canadian Journalists for Justice in Palestine, which is a grassroots organization of journalists. And I think through their work, you can see the way the media ecosystem has both resisted a lot of reporting about Gaza and resisted including and representing Palestinian voices. But you can also see that through the pressure and the efforts of individual journalists that has changed in the last 2 years, that I think we are breaking through and making changes in how institutions, journalism, institutions, excuse me. Such a dramatic moment to need water. I think you can see the impacts. I think you can see that organizing and working collectively, and again, individual journalists standing behind their work, not necessarily standing always behind institutions, but behind their own integrity, can make change. I think together we have a lot of power as collective members. So with that in mind, just thinking about how we do things differently, I just want to talk briefly about the Narwhal. I don't actually know where I'm at for time, Asma. I'm good. All right. Oh, this is one last story I actually want to mention. I love this story. I wrote about Indigenous midwives that are revitalizing Indigenous birth practices. I'm going to breeze past it quickly, but I hope you all read it. Again, I just think like there are so many beautiful, uplifting stories out there, and you should pursue the ones you love. Even if this one took me 3 years to finish, I'm really glad I did it. Moving on. At the Narwhal, I mean, I've spent a lot of time calling out capitalism and evil billionaires in media. I think one of the things that makes the Narwhal special, like many nonprofit outlets, is we don't have any billionaires in the mix. It's largely reader funded, which means I think we're accountable to the people who are reading our reporting to demonstrate its value. And we make it available to anyone who wants to read it. There are no paywalls. You don't have to be a subscriber, though we ask people to support our journalism if they care about it. And we have to make the case by doing that it's worth supporting. So it's a different orientation, I think, to news value. You're not appealing to executives. You're appealing to individual readers. And so each story has to count on its own merits and convince somebody that they would want to support that kind of reporting. And it's a lot of work to appeal directly to readers. We have an audience team at the Narwhal that does the work of ensuring we're responding to all the people who email us about our journalism, that we're encouraging them to sign up and support us. That is distinct, important work. It's equally important and distinct from the work of reporting to build a journalism institution that works. But the fruits of that work, the fact that we reach people, the fact that we get reader emails every day from the individual people who are supporting us, it reminds me that people want journalism to reach them. They want to be informed. Like, I think what stands between journalists and audiences often is not indifference. It's not that people don't care. It's that there's all these obstacles now between people and good reporting. It's hard for them to find. It's hard for them to distinguish from AI slop, from social media content. There's so much noise. There's so much obstruction in some ways. But when you can get through to people, they care. Like, they want this kind of information. They want reporting. And I just really believe that independent media outlets are the future. I stand by that. So when you have a different model of journalism, you can do things differently. This slide is our interviewee guide, which reflects, I think, a lot of the principles that we have and the values and how we report at the Narwhal. It's a resource that we made for people who are being interviewed who may not know how media works. Often, I don't think reporters take the time to explain to people what it means to be interviewed, what it means to be a source, what it means to be quoted in a piece of journalism. And we thought about it often in the context of the Indigenous people that we're approaching in stories, and how many of them are both mistrustful of the process and they just don't know how it works. And things that we take for granted about the process are actually like foreign to people who are outside of journalism. And so it's an effort to make sure they understand what it means to be on the record, what happens after an interview, how we fact check stories, what they can say no to, reminding them that they have power in that relationship as well. And when we published this, there was a really incredible response, both from other outlets, which was really heartening to see, but also from people who read through it and felt like they had learned so much about how reporting worked. I like to think that it gave them more trust and confidence in the process. And I think, again, that transparency, that effort to be human, to remember that we're not, that when we reach out to somebody for an interview, when we write about their story, we're connecting with them on a human level, and making that part of our process and procedure is a really valuable thing. Another thing we do at the Narwhal that I think is great, because we do longer form stories and we're a small newsroom, so we can't do a lot of breaking news, is we're often reporting things over a longer period of time when they're not necessarily like breaking news anymore. And I feel like this is actually such a valuable way to do things, because an event doesn't happen and it's over, like it accrues meaning over time. And by doing a longer and more reflective process, you can actually provide people with a context, again, that they need to understand things. I think it's very hard now for media to compete with like social media for breaking news. I don't know if you guys have seen how many headlines like the Pop Crave Instagram account has broken. But they're gonna beat like the New York Times to the punch. It's really hard to compete with that. So I think what we have to be doing is providing, again, like the broader view of things, the bigger story, the context, the information that people need after the headlines. In BC with the terrible shooting in Tumbler Ridge, there was so much misinformation that exploded out of that event before the reporting. And the responsibility of journalists then was not just to provide people with the facts about what happened, but to try and correct the record, to give them the context to understand that, to represent the people in that community with dementia and humanity. And that's a harder task in some ways, in, I guess, every way, but it's so critical now. And I think, moving away from thinking of things as stories that you have to report the moment they're happening and thinking, what do people need to know about this? What are they gonna need to know tomorrow after they've seen like a handful of headlines about it, is how I try to think about our work. We have a big emphasis on place-based journalism, which is something I think about a lot in my work on reporting on Indigenous communities, Indigenous-led conservation, which are stories that can only be reported in the context of the lands where they're happening. But not even Indigenous stories. I mean, every story is based in a place. Our newest reporter, Leah, is here, and she's done so much amazing reporting from Northern Ontario, from communities like North Bay and Timmins, where being there on the ground, talking to people and representing those places in complexity, that's what makes the stories work, that allows people to connect to them. And I think it's harder and harder for outlets now to justify sending people onto the ground to do on their ground reporting. But I always think that this is a living ecosystem, journalism. It's like a practice that we're engaging in together. And when you go out in real life and talk to people, you're like making real concrete connections. You're building like a circulatory system that pumps blood, that sustains it. You're building the trust, and you're showing people that there's a reciprocal investment. You're spending time hearing their stories. And if you invest in them, I think that, and you show them that you care about their stories and their work, that convinces people to care about your work. I think people see their home, the place that they live, the place that they spend time, represented in media with complexity and accuracy. I think that's the key to reminding them why journalism is something they should care about and something that they should support. How much more time do I have? 5, 10 minutes, that's perfect. Okay. All right. I think a humbling part of doing this work is making mistakes. Mistakes happen. I talk to my students all the time about mistakes because I feel like they're very anxious about it. But even the most impeccable reporters that the most talented, the most meticulous, I wouldn't describe myself as particularly meticulous, so I'm not talking about myself here, but everybody makes mistakes. One of my favorite features from last year was about the New Yorker's fact-checking department, where the fact checkers were all like, yeah, think of any reporter you read in the New Yorker. There's like 6 or 7 errors on that page, like on every single page when it's filed. That's what everybody is like. So mistakes are part of the process. And again, I think of trust in journalism as a process of acknowledging mistakes and correcting them. We have a very transparent corrections policy at the Narwhal. We fact check everything. We try and explain when we make a mistake what it was and how it happened. And years of freelancing, I think, has really taught me that I feel like every mistake, every story is like my personal responsibility, like that I'm personally accountable to every source. I have to apologize if I make an error. I have to reach out to tell them how it happened. I have to try and rebuild their trust. And that sense of personal responsibility also gives me, in some ways, like a sense of entitlement over my work too. Like I feel responsible for the work I'm doing. I feel invested in it. And so, I mean, making a mistake is always scary, but it gives you a chance again to take responsibility and accountability, I think, for the work you're doing, to stand behind it as a person who is fallible, who's willing to acknowledge their mistakes. So, I don't know. I mean, I think when we look at the kind of despair about journalism, sometimes the way it's reported, I think a lot of it comes from people who feel like their career path doesn't exist anymore, that the way they got to where they are is not replicable, that it can't be done. And, you know, I don't know that I would recommend anybody else start a weird art magazine if they someday would like to work at the Narwhal, but I would love to see you all try. But I think it's in some ways fine that things are changing. I don't know that it's a bad thing. Again, like the institutions of journalism were not always welcoming to everybody. Things have to change. There's always a new path. And the point is, like, it's a path that you can create for yourself. I think that's what's exciting. There are so many ways into any story. There are so many stories that are waiting to be told. And it's your specific path through life, like the choices you make, your values, your curiosity that leads you to them and that allows those stories to be meaningful. And so, I mean, the students in this room are already getting a great education, but the most powerful thing that you have, the most important thing is your perspective, your curiosity, your individual human voice. You know, if you want your work to break through, I think this like exhausting cycle of rage bait, clickbait, it has to have substance, it has to be sticky, it has to have a sense that it's like a real person speaking to other real people. It doesn't mean that you only have to tell difficult stories, but it means that the work has to matter to somebody. Like, it has to matter to you. It has to be work that you care about. And there's space for a lot of joy in that. Billy Ray Belcourt, my favorite Cree novelist / poet / essayist, he's this quote that I think about all the time, which is, to my mind, joy is a constitutive part of the emotional rhetoric and comportment of those against whom the present swells at an annihilating pace. With joy, we breach the haze of suffering that denies us creativity in literature. Joy is an art, is an ethics of resistance. So I think all the time, like, every story can make a difference to somebody. And when we think about any problem, this is true of climate change, when we think about it on a grand scale, it's paralyzing. When you try and think about every industry problem, every challenge facing journalism, it's impossible to think of how to respond to a challenge like that. And sometimes I think about the story that we published last year at the Narwhal in Cambridge Bay, which was reported by Chloe Williams and Gavin John. They went to Cambridge Bay in Nunavut, where there's a research team that's piloting this geoengineering project to thicken ice. And they have this radical idea that they could refreeze the entire Arctic. A lot of scientists are very skeptical about the ability to do this at scale, how much it would cost. But a lot of the people in Cambridge Bay are like, okay, but if it can only thicken the ice around Cambridge Bay, like, that's great. That means we can have another generation to teach youth about hunting. We can travel safely. Like, we can preserve these cultural traditions that are so tied to the ice. You know, it doesn't have to solve the entire problem of the warming Arctic, but it can help our people now. And I think about that all the time, that every story, everything you do doesn't have to solve every problem, but every choice you make matters. It has to matter to somebody. And as long as you're exercising that freedom in your human mind and following your values, if you're doing that, your work will have meaning both to you and to the people it reaches. So, thanks. This is my baby. Sure. Should I sit?
Yeah, please have a seat. Some more water. Thank you so much, Michelle. I have some questions that I guess I just. Is this okay? Great. Thank you so much. That was
Thanks.
incredibly moving and really just so great to follow the trajectory from SADMAG all the way to the Narwhal and so many things in between. Thank you so much. I'll start with a question that I have, and maybe if there are other questions that might have come up that might not have made it to me. please come up to the mic when it moves you. So the first question is about how did you deal with editors who are questioning your reporting or expertise, especially when you're reporting on Indigenous issues?
Oh, I mean, I've been lucky to work with mostly really great editors. I think sometimes where it's come up more is when I feel like editors assume that I have expertise that I don't have. I think, like I mentioned, it's often a challenge if you, for instance, are Indigenous. I don't know anything about most Indigenous nations. Like, they're very distinct. And so I feel like sometimes it's a challenge when an editor is like, oh, you're Indigenous, you can report about this First Nation. And I'm one of those people who every time I report about like Mi'kmaq, I have to look up whether it's like a K or a W at the end of Mi'kmaq. It's a very different language. And so, I mean, it's taken a while for me to feel confident enough. I think early on I was like, yes, I can do this. I can do all the learning required and figure it out. And now I'm a little bit more comfortable, I think, just pushing back to say, like, I don't intuitively know this, and I just want you to understand, like, I might not be the person for this story if you're looking for an Indigenous journalist who understands, like, this specific thing. And I think trying to explain to editors that they shouldn't necessarily make assumptions about what every Indigenous journalist is bringing in terms of their cultural and like, historical knowledge. But in terms of, I think, my own personal connection, I mean, I think because I do so much personal kinds of journalism, so many essays, and I think like personal reported features with like a personal component, it's understood that that's the view I'm bringing into it. And again, I just try and be as transparent as possible about what my relationality is and what my position is in the story. I think that's key. Like, I think there's no reason why you can't report on something that you know deeply or care deeply about. It's just about being clear with the reader what that position is.
So connected to what you were saying about non-Indigenous reporters reporting on Indigenous stories, how do you how do you suggest? You said it's really important to bring your positionality into the story. How do you do it when that's not necessarily your positionality?
Oh, I mean, I think like partly when I'm reaching out to sources, I don't know if everybody is this is also one of those things I think I started doing because I didn't go to journalism school and maybe learn the proper way to reach out to people for interviews. But I always introduce myself. Like, if I'm reaching out to somebody for an interview, I always explain who I am. And like for Indigenous stories, when you're talking to other Indigenous people, I think it's important to explain where you come from. So I tell them where my family's from. If they're Cree, I often tell them who my family is because we probably know some people in common. And I give them that sense, and I try and explain why I'm doing the story. So like what the story is about, but why I'm interested in it, why I want to talk to them specifically. And I try and make sure they understand like where I'm coming from, because then they have the information they need about whether and how to engage with me. And I'm a big fan of doing like pre-reporting calls where before a formal interview, I just like to talk to people and give them a chance to ask questions, to get to know me a bit. But when I'm not bringing any kind of personal knowledge, I do try and do my homework. I always say if you're reporting on Indigenous communities, go to that First Nations Facebook page. That's going to give you a real sense of what's going on. It's a great place to learn a little bit about the community. But doing your homework and then just being transparent about what you don't know. Like, I think earlier in my career, I had this real anxiety about seeming ignorant or seeming like I wasn't totally knowledgeable, but you miss more things by pretending that you have your head wholly around it. Like, I feel like nobody is offended if you go in and you're like, can you tell me more about that? I'm not familiar with it. Or like, I don't know anything about that. Can you explain it to me? And that's where I feel like, with, for instance, my students, with some of my peers, like people have this fear that they're going to go into an Indigenous community and offend somebody if they don't know everything. Nobody expects you to know everything. I think that helps.
Yeah, that's really good advice. If there's anybody who has questions who would like to come up to the mic, please feel free at this time. But I have some more here. This one's fun. What were you most excited to share with us today?
Oh, this photo of my baby. What was I most excited to share? I was really excited to talk about reporting that story with Connie because it was really such a wonderful experience to work on and challenging again. Like I said, that the story changed halfway through. in some ways, in terms of like what it was about, from being like a very straightforward success story about this incredible journalism legend to like a story about what the industry is fucking up. Excuse me. And to share it with Connie in the room was very exciting and kind of terrifying, but she's so lovely. Yeah, it's really great. I mean, I feel like sometimes in Vancouver, we're in a little bit of a silo. It's nice to come to Toronto, where the center of the journalism world really is.
Actually, I loved what you said, were to say, you started off with is by saying to put more of your human self into your work. What, can you sort of, how do you do that? How do you bring that into your work?
Oh, I like this question. I mean, I do. I feel like I talk about this with my students a lot. Like sometimes I feel like it's possible to report something accurately and even comprehensively and come away with no understanding of like why, I read the assignments and I'm like, well, why do you care about this? Like, it's hard to tell what you're interested in. And I think the best writing, again, is like, you need to be able to convince somebody that a story is worth sticking with. And the only way to do that is if you understand what's interesting about it to you. Like if you understand what the compelling part of it is. Especially, I mean, with features, like, because I write a lot of features, it's a big investment of somebody's time and you have to keep them engaged. And the way to do that is to keep them excited about what they're reading or curious. And so I think you have to understand when you're writing a story, like not just what is the story about, but why do you care about it? And you have to make that, I think, perceptible to the reader, partly because, again, I think they have to understand where you're coming from, what your perspective on it is. Like when I write about Indigenous rights, it's very obvious that I support Indigenous rights. Like, I'm not coy about it. I'm not like, are they good? Are they bad? Who can say? And it's fine if people don't agree with me. Like, I feel like a lot of people who read my work do not agree with my, strident positions on recognizing things like Indigenous sovereignty. And that's fine. I don't care if they agree with me, but I need them to engage with what my arguments are. And to do that, they have to understand where I'm coming from. Like, nobody is really served, I think, by coyness in reporting where you're like, I can't tell what this person is really trying to say. I think if we want to move these issues forward, if we want to report on important things that people have different views on and different perspectives and are coming to them from different orientations or values, then we have to like put those values on the table and let people engage with them in their substance, not just the facts, but again, the context they operate in. So if I write something about Indigenous rights, like I'm happy for people to disagree with me on it, but I want them to engage with the substance of what I'm trying to say, and the substance of where I'm coming from. I think that's like the point of connection that I'm always trying to get to in my work, is like to make somebody really push past what they think they know about it or what they think they believe, and they can challenge my arguments, but they have to be challenged as well.
Yeah, I think it's so important when you were talking about the work that you do on Pretendian investigations and how fraught that is for you personally, and how you see that as an opportunity for education and for context. How do you, what advice might you have? Because I hear this a lot from students that when they're in, they're in more mainstream newsrooms, or they're like more junior, like when they start, and they want to tell a bigger story, but the demands of what's expected of them is so different. What advice would you have for them?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it is hard to work up to a story like that. I mean, doing a Pretendian investigation is hard in many ways. You're really prying into people's lives, which is kind of uncomfortable. They're very personal and sensitive. People are very protective, obviously, of their family history. They're not neutral topics for anybody. And I feel like it's challenging to do any kind of investigative work that is like, you're talking about real people's lives, like not just events, but like them as people. So, I mean, I think it's important to feel like you're really prepared for that and that you're properly supported to do that work. Like I was lucky to work on the first big story I did, the Gina Adams one, at the BAM Center, where I had faculty there who were working with me on that story who could talk me through like the emotional dimensions of reporting it. I feel really lucky to work with Harley at the Walrus, who's a really great editor and also like comes at these stories with a lot of human perspective and is, I think you need to feel supported as a journalist to do it. So I would say if people are in these early roles where they don't feel like they have the newsroom support, like it can be really challenging. It's such a huge responsibility, and it shouldn't be only your responsibility. But in terms of practical advice, I would say, you should do a really good job on the assignments that you're given and like work your way up to the point of having the credibility to pitch something that's longer and more ambitious. And honestly, I am a big fan of like, if you can't find somebody to say yes, try and do it yourself. Like apply for a grant, apply for a residency, start working on it and see where you get. Like I think there is, in some ways, what I think is really fun and scary about freelancing is like the proof of concept is really like you have to do the work and prove its value to somebody. You have to pitch it. You have to convince them that it's a good story. You have to like do the story, and once you do it, you can demonstrate its value. So in some ways, like you have to be willing, I think, to invest in your idea and take it to the point where you feel like it's convincing either to you or others that it's worth doing.
Thanks. I think we have a question. Yeah, come on up.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk.
Thanks.
So you mentioned that you're a social media hater,
Yes.
and you also brought up the trend of influencers rebranding themselves as citizen journalists.
Yes.
On the topic of objectivity and putting yourself into your work, do you think there's a positive aspect to the fact that these people's work is now immediately tied to their social media profile? Like they have to be accountable to what they're saying, and you know who they are and where they come from?
Yeah, I can see that. I do think there's value in the fact that in some ways like journalists are more reachable and that we can engage in like a sort of ecosystem about our work. My concern sometimes is like that on social media, I mean, I see a lot of videos, for instance, sort of re-reporting the news, and there's a sense there that I would be terrified to do any serious reporting in such isolation that I don't have like an editor's oversight or people checking that I'm accurate. Like there's so much potential for error there. And I do think like you can see in comments, for instance, on these posts when people are calling out mistakes, but there isn't really accountability in the sense that like a journalism outlet is accountable to make a correction on a story. And mostly I'm a social media hater, partly because I think like most social media is devoid now of news. I mean, I was a big fan of Twitter for many years. I was a very active poster. I had a posting personality. And now it's just a white supremacist platform for like racist conspiracy theories, which is really sad and tragic. Instagram and Facebook you can't post news there. And so I just think there's something kind of fraught about positioning something as reporting if it's not happening in an ecosystem of accountability or transparency. But at the same time, I mean, I will acknowledge that the explosion of social media allowed a lot of people to have access to reporters, to voices that they wouldn't otherwise have. Like social media is how I think a lot of us got our information from what was happening in Gaza on the ground from people who are posting about their lives. That's invaluable. But I think it's not like necessarily a substitute or a replacement for journalism that happens in these more structured contexts.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And with that, if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you so much, Michelle, for giving us so much to think about and coming to talk to us. Also, I'd like to thank Connie Walker for doing such a wonderful introduction, Jacqueline Mika, Julia Lawrence, and Atkinson Foundation, and thank you, Zan, for handling the questions. There is a small reception. There's some food in the next room, so please enjoy, and hopefully there's lots for you to talk about over the food.